Hello, everybody. It's Janet Heimlich and my daughter Maxine and Dale McGowan to talk to you about parenting beyond belief. And you may notice that Clare Wuellner is not with us today because she is not manning but womaning a table at CFI's conference. She is taking care of talking to folks about Foundation Beyond Belief. And so I'm your sit-in host in lieu of Clare being with us today. So Clare, I'll try to do you proud. Let me start with saying welcome to Parenting Beyond Belief Season 2, Episode 3 for February 9th, 2019. Parenting Beyond Belief is a production of the Atheist Community of Austin, which is organized as a nonprofit educational corporation to develop and support the atheist community, to provide opportunities for socializing and friendship, to promote secular viewpoints, to encourage positive atheist culture, to defend the First Amendment principle of state-church separation, to oppose discrimination against atheists, and to work with other organizations in pursuit of common goals. So, as I said, I'm Janet Heimlich. I founded an organization called the Child Friendly Faith Project, and I also sit on the board of Foundation Beyond Belief. I am also the author of this cheery book, oh, there we are, I don't have to hold it up, called Breaking Their Will, which looks at religious child abuse and neglect. As I mentioned to you, I have with us also our special guest, Maxine, my daughter. She is 15, and she's here to answer questions and talk about thoughts coming from the young folks species. That could be particularly enlightening, given that I'm new to parenting. Every year I become just a new mother of, next year it'll be a 16-year-old. So we're all trying to learn as we go along. And of course, we have with us Dale McGowan, who's the editor and co-author of Parenting Beyond Belief and of Raising Free Thinkers. And Dale also has now begun a new podcast called Raising Free Thinkers. Great to have you with us as always, Dale.
Good to be here. Thanks.
Have a few announcements, so I'm going to get those out of the way before we jump in and talk about the theme of this show, which is curiosity. So, first announcement is, on Valentine's Day, February 14th, we are having a live secular sexuality show followed by a performance from Shelley Siegel. And I think we're going to go to a little commercial on that.
Make this Valentine's Day one to remember. It's time to get sexy. Live in Austin, Texas, an intimate performance by recording artist Shelley Siegel follows a live taping of Secular Sexuality. Food is included and drinks will be available for purchase. Get your tickets now by going to eventbrite.com and search for Secular Sexuality. That's eventbrite.com, search Secular Sexuality.
Cool. The February newsletter, Thinking Aloud, is out. So take a look at that and let us know what you think. Finally, Darwin Day is today. And okay, thank you. There's the graphic you can see what this great newsletter looks like. Darwin Day is today, and in Austin, where we are, you can head on down to the UT J.J. Pickle Research Campus from noon to 5 p.m. There are activities there for both kids and adults, and there's some info on your screen. If you want to jot some of that down, if you live in our fair city, check out all the things to do relating to Darwin Day. So, as I said before, our theme of today's show is curiosity. But what I want to do first is to tell you a little bit of news surrounding parenting, and we did this last show a month ago. When there was an article in the New York Times that related to what we had been talking about in the previous show, and so I read a little from that article. Well, I found another great parenting article in the New York Times that I would love to share with you. It's on helicopter parenting. Now, these days, helicopter parenting gets a really bad name, and I've always kind of cringed when I've heard people be really disparaging about helicopter parents. I tend to think that it's a reaction, this kind of residual reactions people keep having against anything that seems to want to give more autonomy and freedom to children. And so this article, which talks about some important studies, actually affirms my belief. So, of course, I always like that. This pretty much focuses around a book called Love, Money, and Parenting, How Economics Explains the Way We Raise Our Kids. And so up till now, psychologists, sociologists, and journalists have spent more than a decade diagnosing and critiquing the habits of so-called helicopter parents and their school obsessions. They insist that hyper-parenting backfires, creating a generation of stressed-out kids who can't function alone. Parents themselves alternate between feeling guilty, panicked, and ridiculous. But what this new book shows, based on some very well-done studies, the authors say it's true that high-octane, hardworking child rearing has some pointless excesses, and it doesn't spark joy for parents all the time. But done right, it works for kids, not just in the United States, but in rich countries around the world. The authors explain that in the 1970s, strict parenting gave way to an era of permissive parenting, going too far the other direction, giving children lots of freedom with little oversight. In the 1980s, however, permissive parenting was replaced by helicopter parenting. So permissive parenting, of course, is not healthy for children. And when people talk about getting away from authoritarian parenting, they're not advocating for permissive parenting. They're advocating for authoritative parenting, which falls in between. And it seems that helicopter parenting was trying to find some sort of middle ground. So the authors go on to say that American parents eventually increase their hands-on caregiving by about 12 hours a week. It's not enough just to hover over your kids, however. If you do, it is an authoritarian parent, defined as someone who issues directives, expects children to obey, and sometimes hits those who don't. You won't get the full benefits. The most effective parents, according to the authors, are authoritative. They use reasoning to persuade kids to do things that are good for them. Instead of strict obedience, they emphasize adaptability, problem solving, and independence, skills that will help their offspring in future workplaces that we can't even imagine yet, because this is relatively new. It says the benefits can be academic, but in addition, a British study, kids raised by authoritative parents reported better health and higher self-esteem. In an American study, they were less likely to use drugs, smoke, or abuse alcohol. They started having sex at older ages, and they were more likely to use condoms. So this is a little thing that jumped out to me. Why wouldn't everyone just become an authoritative parent? Religious people, quoting here, religious people, regardless of their income, are more likely to be authoritarian parents who expect obedience and believe in corporal punishment. I think that gives you a nice big chunk from this article, but I think it does reflect a lot of the things we've been saying on this show about the values of authoritative parenting. And just little side note that I just have to mention from this article, and the last thing I'll say about it is, from this study, it found that respondents who valued self-reliance and creativity in children, staples of both authoritative and permissive parenting, were more likely to have voted for Hillary Clinton in 2016. Those with more authoritarian views on parenting were more likely to have voted for Donald Trump. Somehow that doesn't seem too surprising. I guess before we jump from this, Dale, is there anything you think to add about that article or some of the points it raised?
Uh, well, it crosses into some of my favorite territory. The whole authoritative authoritarian dichotomy has a lot of great research behind it. And as you said, authoritative parenting has the research on its side. The outcomes are best with authoritative parenting. The labels drive me bananas because they pick these two words that are only 4 letters different. And so while I'm in the middle of talking about it, I'm constantly misspeaking and talking about authoritarian when I mean authoritative and vice versa. But the article, I think, is terrific. It's right on the money. And at the same time, it does something that makes me crazy, which is, it's really the headline more than anything. And the use of the term helicopter parenting. Because the first thing you have to ask when, if somebody comes up to me and says, do you think helicopter parenting is a good idea? I have to say, what do you mean by that? What do you mean by that? It's like when somebody talks about spirituality, you always have to say, hold on. Define it. What do you mean by that? And then we can talk. It's the same thing with this. If helicopter parenting means this sort of high pressure, anxiety inducing over presence of the parents, that's a bad thing. That's a verifiably bad thing. But if it's referring, as the article appears to be, if it's referring to attentive parenting, parents who are involved in their kids' lives, who are hands-on in a positive and productive way, who are being very supportive, that is something that the research bears out as being a good thing. So it's just that the terms can be problematic. But you just have to parse it down a little bit and figure out what is meant by it, by everybody in the conversation. And once you do that, this article really, I think, makes excellent points about sort of where we are, not just in the swinging pendulum of things, but in the research. What have we determined actually has the best outcomes for kids?
Right. And when everyone initially gets on board with how we're defining terms, then we can always have a more productive conversation.
Right.
Max, do you have any thoughts on how you might have observed your colleagues at school, in high school, how maybe their different ways that their parents interact with them, and how you've seen maybe how outcomes from that by the way their kids act or take care of their needs?
Yeah, I feel like when a parent is too overbearing or too distant from their kids, it really shows in the classroom. The kids, both of them, are very slow to raise their hands in class. They're very slow to participate in part of the group. They usually have lower confidence and are not very energetic in the social environment. Seeing them interact with their parents, it's very easy to tell when they feel uneasy being with them versus a very supportive parent like my own. I'm always very eager to talk about my day, talk about you at school.
You talk about me at school?
I do.
Oh, I'll have to find out more about that. Interesting. Very interesting. Wow. Okay, well, let's then now jump into this topic of curiosity. And Dale, I think I'm going to hand it to you and to talk about this idea.
Sure. I love the fact that we landed on this at this point, because by coincidence, my podcast, the Raising Freethinkers podcast, is in the middle of a series on curiosity. So I've been up to my neck in it, and it's really one of my favorite parenting topics, because it started me in my non-religious parenting work. I've told the story a million times of my son, who was attending a Lutheran preschool when he was 4 years old, and one day I asked him, Connor, why are you growing so big? Just this sort of casual question. And he said, I don't know. I guess God just wants me to grow. And I just about fell over, not because of the God part of the answer. It really wasn't that. It was the very first time I'd heard him give an incurious reply. It's the first time I ever had heard him give an answer and that essentially wasn't an answer, that basically punted it to somebody else. In this case, it's God. I don't know, and I don't need to know. And that really got me thinking about how I wanted to be as a parent. Separate from that, reporters, when I do interviews over the years about the books, every once in a while, a reporter would ask a question that I think is a really interesting question. It makes you think about your parenting. They would ask, if there's one thing you could give your kids, one value that you could instill in them to carry through the rest of their lives, what would it be? And I blew this question for years because I kept not having an answer. I kept saying, oh, you can't boil it down to one thing. There are 8 different things. There's, empathy and courage and honesty and openness and generosity and gratitude. I'd have this whole list of things. And then I'd hang up the phone and I go, yeah, I hate that I do that, because I should be able to say that there's something at the core. There's something that leads to all these things. And for a while, I thought it was critical thinking, right? I want them to be critical thinkers, and I certainly do. I want them to be empathetic. So I would say, well, critical thinking and empathy and happiness. And I'd start with the list again. But I finally realized over time that curiosity lies at the root of all these other values that I wanted to impart to them. It actually comes before a lot of these values. And one of the things that drives me crazy about the religious worldview frequently is how incurious it is. That it just stops asking questions. It becomes satisfied with the first comfortable answer that comes up. For example, critical thinking. Critical thinking is a set of tools to understand the world, to see the world clearly. But the fact is, you don't just want to hand your kids the tools. What you want them to have first is the hunger. You want them to have the desire to see the world clearly. And that's what curiosity is. So if you raise a child from the very beginning, just finding the world fascinating, finding the world something that they want to understand, they want to see clearly, then they say, okay, how can I see it clearly? How can I avoid, confirmation bias and all these other things that get in the way? Well, critical thinking is the way. That's the set of tools that serves your curiosity. And even something like empathy, which you would think is completely separate from curiosity. The fact is that you are not empathetic until you're curious about how someone else feels, about what their experience is like.
Wow.
So that's yet another thing that's rooted in curiosity. It's the opposite of fear. Fear is that thing that closes you in. It makes you defensive. It makes you closed off and uninterested in the world. Curiosity is an openness. It's a willingness to engage the world. And it really, I think, is my fundamental parenting value.
Wow, that is fascinating. Do you have any thoughts just in terms of in academia or when you're wanting to learn new things, like what do you think parents need to understand about allowing that openness to be there, the open door, so that before trying to teach all these tools and things?
Well, I was raised in 2 households with 2 different parents. One in secular and one is Christian. And whenever I had a question, I expressed curiosity. In my religious home, I was always either shut down or given kind of a half answer. If it was maybe an uncomfortable topic or a topic that they didn't know, I would just, I wouldn't get an answer. I wasn't told to go research myself. I was just shut down. Versus in my secular home, it almost, got a little too much. If I didn't know how to spell a word or I didn't know something, my mom would make sure, drill it into me that I know and we learn it together. And give me the tools to express my curiosity further.
So I didn't always make it easy by just giving you the answer. No. Yeah. Well, I think that's all fascinating. Dale, is there anything else you wanted to add to that? We do have a caller from the UK.
Oh, I'm fine to go to the call, and then we can return to it if we have time at the end.
That sounds great. We have Ian He says a school in the UK canceled Darwin Day play. How can secular parents respond? And here is Ian. Ian, can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me?
We can, and it's so great to have you with us. Thank you for your very important question here. Why don't you, I've sort of summarized it, but tell us from your perspective, your concern and what's come up.
Yeah, the play was roughly about Darwin's theory of evolution and the arguments it had with other scientists and clergy. And the reason parents were threatening to take the children out of the play and in some cases the school is because he was telling a particular bishop that they were wrong and that religion or Christianity's explanation of the origins is wrong. And there's apparently an argument and a song that the children were singing, and the parents didn't think it was appropriate for the children to be taught that it was correct to challenge the religious beliefs. I'm led to believe they were all Christian. However, it could have been any religious people. Mm-hmm. I mean, my take on it is that it's wrong for the parents to act this way because of the body of evidence behind evolution, for example. And for parents to have such a huge control, or a minority of parents have such a huge control over what the majority do, is an unfair balance in power.
Wow, that was really exemplified there. So they shut down the play?
Yeah, I believe they replaced it with something else. Unfortunately, it's from another part of the country to myself. It's in Cheshire. Mm-hmm. And the school have said they may do it next year, but a revised version of it where it severely tones down how true evolution actually is, even though Darwin's theory wasn't quite right.
Wow. What was the age group of the children involved with the production and the audience?
4 to 11.
4 to 11. And would you explain just a little bit, because I've spent some time in England and got to understand a little bit more about the school system there and how when we talk about the separation between church and state, it's a little different there. Can you help our viewers understand how schools are set up that way, even if they're, quote, public schools?
Yeah, the school system is that we still have religious education where we are meant to teach all or as many faiths as possible, as this is what they believe and why they believe it, rather than this is true. There are some exemptions to it because we do have, obviously, religious schools where they are able to put more emphasis on their particular religion, but it's still meant to be a relatively secular curriculum.
Dale, how about you talk about this? And do you have a particular question, Ian, you want to ask us about that?
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I'd like your thoughts about this situation. And secondly, how could parents and potentially schools go about actually stopping this from happening in future while still giving a good standard of education to children?
Thank you so much. Okay, Dale, I'm going to hand it to you.
Yeah, I think you've understood the terms perfectly of why this is problematic. The theory of evolution is settled science. It's not a religious statement. It's not an anti-religious statement. It's a scientific statement, and to celebrate that is something that the schools should be about. It's something that they should be doing. Two points I want to make. There was actually an excellent study done, I think, by the University of Pennsylvania, and this one was centered in the United States, but it applies to educational institutions throughout the Western world, I'm sure. They looked at what it is that interferes with science education in schools. And they found that roughly 13% of science teachers in the United States in K through 12 classrooms are creationists. But they found that the creationists forcing their point of view into the curriculum were not the primary problem getting in the way of science literacy for kids. That wasn't the primary problem. The primary problem was administrators and teachers who were engaging in conflict avoidance and watering down the curriculum, getting rid of elements like this play is a perfect example of that. By trying to smooth the waters and avoid conflict, they're actually measurably getting in the way of the science literacy of the kids. So I recommend, this study was about 6 years ago. I'm almost sure it was the University of Pennsylvania. If you want to try to pull that up, the second part of my answer would be to go to the administrators to frame it entirely in terms of science, entirely in terms of science education. It has nothing, because it doesn't have anything to do with a secular versus religious point of view. And to say that obviously in as well-mannered an approach as you can possibly manage, to say that it really is problematic for the school to be withdrawing, because that sends a signal to the kids as well, withdrawing their support for something that celebrates this piece of quite exciting settled science that the kids should know about. If you can share that study as well to say that conflict avoidance, which this clearly was because they were bowing to pressure from the parents, that conflict avoidance is getting in the way of science literacy, that may very well reach an administrator. One of the things that I've found in conflicts in the schools is that you are very likely, as you move up the chain, to quickly find someone who will be, for whom this argument will resonate. If you have a teacher who doesn't understand it, who is bowing to the pressure, or who is ultra-religious or something, that's one thing. The tendency is most of the time that when you go to the administration, the very next level, they will very well understand when they've got a problem on their hands that needs to be rectified, where they're getting in the way of the kids' education. So I would recommend doing it on those terms, strictly on the basis of the science, and using that study if you can get a hold of that.
I agree, and I don't know if you can take it to this level or feel comfortable doing so, but the way that this whole thing strikes me is, I keep coming back to what the role of educators is. Their primary focus is not to make themselves feel good or to make their jobs easier. They are there to serve the educational needs of the students. And so as Dale was saying, they're basically role modeling. If something makes you uncomfortable, you shut it down and you close the door on that curiosity and children's need to explore, any question that comes to mind and expand on their intellectual need for exploration and so forth. And we were talking earlier about authoritarian parenting, and it seems so often the case in religious communities, especially conservative ones, whether it's a religious school or a place of worship, that there is this need, just like the parents do to their kids, this need to control the community. And so there are feelings of fear, mistrust, inability to just let things take their course, let people ask questions and learn and decide for themselves what their worldviews are. And that seems exactly what has happened with this play. I also find it incredibly hypocritical that on Darwin Day, they could not see the need to have some education even on that one particular day. If this were a Christmas play, I don't think anyone would be up in arms saying, well, this is only the viewpoint of certain people and we should not have a Christmas play. So, I find the whole thing to come from authoritarian roots and be generally harmful for the kids. So if it can be brought back to, in approaching administrators, for example, to talk about their role and the need for them to serve students, I think that could be very helpful. Is there something you wanted to add, Max?
I do not think it's right for the administration to censor these beliefs, especially with kids this young and this impressionable. I think the classroom should express both beliefs and allow the children to choose their own way of thinking, not have an ideology forced upon them.
Absolutely. Ian, any other thoughts you want to share with us?
Yeah, just to reply to points that you've all made. It went all the way up to the head of the school, who then made the final decision to cancel for the reasons that you've all laid out. And there's also been, in reply to Janet, there's also been upheaval because some schools around the country wanted to do the nativity, but in modern day times. It's like instead of using a donkey, they use a clapped-out car, and there was a huge uproar about that.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, and just about the authoritarian, it's a case of the parents seem to think that they know better than the trained professionals in the schools who mostly across the board in the UK, with some exceptions, they see the professionalism of their being a teacher overruling what they believe religiously, and generally speaking are quite even within it all, which makes it even the more worse.
One thing that occurs to me, if you've gone to the top of the administration and haven't had the right response, there's an opportunity for public education. And one of the things that you could seek out is an opportunity for an op-ed in a local or regional paper. And ideally, the really ideal situation is to have it co-authored by a secular and a progressive religious parent. So that because you're not going to have much difficulty finding progressive Christians, especially in the UK, who are perfectly fine with Darwin and with the theory of evolution. If you can demonstrate that immediately helps to dismiss this idea that it's a strictly religious versus secular thing. And I think a good op-ed in a prominent paper would be a terrific way to do that, or to even try to get some time on a local newscast or something to keep the issue alive and to really say it's not just about this play. It's something that we need.
Independent.
Right.
The Independent took up the article, and Pathos did as well.
Yes, that's a great source, Pathos.
Wonderful. Yeah.
Yeah, taking exactly that route, although they did speak to a fundamentalist for British standards, but not by American standards.
Right.
Even taking their view of it, it was still positive towards the Clare.
Good.
And I was going to ask you if there has been any media exposure at this point.
Yeah, the Independent national newspaper, Pathos as well, which I couldn't even tell you where they're based. But
they've covered
a lot of social media. Yeah, it's had a lot of social media coverage as well.
Well, that's good.
Good. Well, yeah. So something good could come out of it in that way. That it really could. Even if the play itself isn't reinstituted, it could be that the very next time this decision comes up, all of that conversation around it will have a better informed public, better informed administrators. That's the hope.
Right. And
that's when the headmaster turned around and says maybe next year, but it'll be a watered down version. Constantly paraphrasing there.
Right.
So. Will the education standards still be so high?
Right. And it is so frustrating when things move so slowly, especially when it's coming from an educational body. But the more press attention you can bring to it, preferably well in advance, so that they can't say the excuse that, well, we've already set up our curriculum or what our plays are going to be, the better. Because school administrators not only don't like conflict, they also really don't like bad PR.
That's true.
Ian, I want to thank you so much for bringing this to our attention. It's something even we in the U.S. can certainly relate to, and so thank you. I hope you'll call back at a future time and let us know if things shifted. I hope they do for the better.
So do I. Okay. Thank you for taking my call. Have a good evening.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Oh, wow, that gets so frustrating when, it's their public school system. And, we have those fights here, but religion is so much more ingrained in their public school system than it is even here. So,
yeah, it's fascinating because it's simultaneously a more secular society, and yet they've got the Church of England integrated into the schools in a
the
formalized
government
way. Yeah, right.
It's we don't think about that too often here, but it's there. And when I was working with a reporter for The Guardian, which is based in London, they have a strong presence in the U.S. and around the world. It was about an abuse case, and actually involved decades of abuse at a place in North Texas called Cal Farley's Boys Ranch, and we had at least a dozen men who were willing to come forward to talk about how they were so egregiously, physically, emotionally, sexually abused at this institution in the past, and this goes back to the 1940s. Even though we had all of those folks making a pattern of allegations. The Guardian it was reluctant to publish the story because they don't have freedom of the press there like we have here. But ultimately what happened was the CEO of the organization did acknowledge those abuses happened, so the article was allowed to be published. So, yeah, we have those obstacles, and we just always have to keep pushing against them. Well, I think I'd like to go back to our topic, and I think a lot of what Ian was bringing up really does have a lot to do with the need to allow children to be curious. The dedication in my book, as I've said before, is to children who were denied the right to question. And I just think that's so important. And Maxine, you go to a great school. It's a small private school with great teachers. And, they really do value the idea of children having intellectual autonomy and following their curiosities. Is there anything you want to say about how your school goes about really celebrating that aspect of your lives?
My school has a class set aside every Thursday called Discussions Class, where we are allowed to choose a topic that, as a group, we find very fascinating or important to talk about. And it is almost entirely student-led. We pick the prompts to talk about. We have our group discussions, and we come to a resolution. It's very open. There's no censoring of opinions. If someone is an outright Trump supporter or a Bernie Sanders lover, we all express our opinions and are respected in that environment.
Fantastic. Dale, what about your kids? How are their schools helping them to explore their curiosities?
It's hit and miss. They're in a really tremendous district and in very high-performing schools. But every once in a while, we've run into individual teachers shutting things down. Where there will be I don't even remember I should call my daughter down. Tell me what the subject was, but there is probably abortion. That the classroom discussion was they were having an open opportunity to discuss, just very much like what Maxine is describing, to discuss a topic that they found interesting. The class gravitated toward abortion as a topic for discussion. And these are kids who are entirely capable of having this discussion. You know, the adults can't frequently, but the kids are much better at doing this. And the teacher shut it down. Wouldn't know, you got to go to a different topic. They wouldn't allow that choice. And that's, I wouldn't say that that's the reaction most of the time. Most of the time they've had, you know, really terrific teachers, really supportive, willing to have open inquiry. My daughter leads the Secular Student Alliance chapter at her high school and has a faculty sponsor for that who's very open and supportive with it. So there are a lot, I would have to say that there's on balance a lot more support for curiosity and sort of fearless inquiry than there is opposition. But every once in a while it rears its ugly head.
Yeah, so often it just comes down to who the teacher is in the room, or
Yep.
who the individual who's overseeing a program. And I think, Max, when you were talking about there's no censorship with the dialogue, I'm wondering about how there is respect, how that is encouraged, how that is taught, so that people are not just using a no censorship type of forum to be abusive, for example. So are there kind of tools that are put in place to prevent that kind of behavior?
Yeah, we are split up into groups of 8 to 10 kids, all in little circles around the classroom, and each student, or each group, is assigned one student that will be the student leader of that day in that group. And they moderate the conversation. They make sure it's not going off topic, and it's a new person every time. I wouldn't say there is no censorship. I would say there has not been a case of censorship yet. The topics we've talked about, such as healthcare, which is going to be pretty important in our lives in a couple of years. We've talked about the Me Too movement, gun control. I don't feel a need for those topics to be censored, especially at our age group, which is making a lot of progress in government and in our social lives. I would say a student-governed discussion is really what allows us to feel free and feel respected in the situation.
And I'm thinking also, Dale, to what you said in the beginning about the importance of having there be an environment or just a feeling of openness, so that, you know, I always say that our jobs as parents is foremost to just be observers. We're there to prevent bad things from happening and to provide guidance. But really, and this is why I always reject this idea, parenting is so hard, it's so difficult. I just have never, there have been challenges along the way, but maybe part of the problem is like many parents just feel the need to, you know, they think they're responsible for everything. And it's hard to just let go a little bit and to just observe your child, you know, perhaps about to make a mistake or that kind of thing. But I think that has to happen in order for them to find answers for themselves. So any thoughts on that, about sort of how to open those doors in the early years and knowing how those doors might change in terms of the how, as kids get older, we allow them more autonomy, more ability to learn about the world, learn how to interact with others, but still provide that guidance so that they're not harming themselves or other people.
Yeah, it's just such a great bundle of topics. One of the things that occurs to me that is a little humbling when you look at the research, developmental research, parents overestimate their role in their kids' upbringing. there, a lot of times parents will ask, how am I going to teach my kid X, whatever it is? How am I going to get them to do whatever? How am I going to teach them ethics? The answer primarily is you mostly won't. It's mostly not going to come from you. I'm sorry. You're terribly important to your child, but not as important as you think. Ethical education, for example, comes primarily from peers, not primarily from parents. What the parent does is lay the foundation and create the environment in which the learning can happen. So whether it's ethical education or curiosity, science education, whatever it is, you can be there as a guide. You can be there, as you said, observing and being a resource as needed. But what you mostly want to do is try desperately to get out of the way so that a child is able to run. In order to do that, you do want to plant seeds early on, like especially with curiosity. I started with my kids with two things when they were seriously 18 months old, 2 years old. I would try to say wow a lot, have a reaction of something being amazing. And then the next sentence is a question. It's how. So wow and how. You say, wow, look at the sunset. It's absolutely amazing. I wonder how it gets that color. I wonder why it's that color. And you don't even have to get to the answer. This is another thing that I think is a lot of parents think that you've got to immediately rush to the internet and get the answers. Sometimes that's fine. But what you want to do is simply give them the message that there are answers, that there are questions to be asked. The world is wonderful. And the way you get at an understanding of it is through questions, by actually asking those questions. So by pairing up the wow and how, from the time my kids were very, very young, they got the idea that when they encountered something that was amazing, they were predisposed to find it amazing in the first place. And then immediately they'd start asking a question on their own because we had set that up from the time they were very young. So I didn't have to continue this through, all the grades. I didn't have to be there making sure that they were finding the world fascinating. You plant those seeds early on, and then you get out of their way and let them run. It's really, just like you said, it's a matter of at some point letting them be free, giving them the support that they need, but then watching it happen and having the enjoyment of that. That's where I am now. My kids are old, and to see that has sort of played out so beautifully in their lives. They are entirely self-motivated thinkers and curious engagers with the world because I tried very hard to get out of their way.
That's wonderful. And I'm thinking too about how psychologists talk about the best way to teach, it's not really an active thing, but the best way to teach morals, good behavior, respect, and that kind of thing is simply by role modeling. So just live your life in an ethical way, and kids are watching. So it's really not so much that it has to be instruction, just being the kind of person that you admire, and your children will learn from that. And one thing I've run across in so many interviews I've done with people who have been raised in religious communities, especially the ones that are quite authoritarian, or not even that authoritarian, evangelical communities, say, or Orthodox Jewish communities. Parents are feeling like the spotlight is on them all the time, and they're trying to role model perfection. That is unhealthy for everybody. You will make mistakes, and by showing your child how you respond to your own mistakes can be really, really helpful. For example, to acknowledge that you screwed up on something, and then how do you respond to that realization? So all of that is kind of part of that package of role modeling. Thoughts, Max?
Yeah. I feel like a mistake that a lot of parents make is trying to turn their kids into mini-me's, like talk how they talk, do what they do, act how they act, when they don't realize that their kids are their own people and they shouldn't be molding their kids into a person. They should allow their kids to mold themselves. They should be a guide, not an enforcer.
Cool. Wow. So we don't have, Mark, tell me if I have this wrong, but I don't see another caller. If I have that wrong, let me know, because my screen could have frozen or something. Dale, what do you think we should go to next? And then I think we might be close to wrapping up.
Well, there is one of the other things that I'm getting into in the podcast is the research around the value of curiosity, this specific value for the developing person, and I can get into some of those if you'd like.
Yeah, please.
Okay. There have been some great studies. There was one in the Journal of Psychology and Aging, I think it was, that 5-year study looked at people between the ages of 60 and 86, and it determined a number of measures of personality at the beginning of the study. And those in the study, 1,000, I think the N was 1,000 in the subjects in the study. Those who were ranked most curious at the beginning of the study were most likely to be alive at the end of the study. You know, that actually being engaged in the world and curious about the world is something that in your later years actually leads you to be healthier. You know, it leads you to be more likely to have longevity. Intelligence is another one. There was a study in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology found that highly curious toddlers would have higher IQs and reading abilities when they were 12 than toddlers who were less curious. Better analytic abilities, better problem-solving skills, better overall intelligence. And this is curiosity drives intelligence in a really obvious way. It's something that I've also noticed. I've become convinced that our kids are learning in a different model, in a really fundamentally different model from the one that we learned in, and that it's partly because it's curiosity driven. My kids have an enormous amount of their knowledge self-gained from the internet, you know, from their time spent online. They don't spend all their time in entertainment. They certainly spend some. But my youngest, Delaney, is 17, and she is into Vox Explained videos. They're just fantastic. And, you know, it's just runs through just a wide number of topics. Adam Ruins Everything is another great video series. Just absolutely fantastic stuff. Yeah. And Mythbusters and so on. So here's what happens. You watch a video like that online, and then you get to the end of it and you've got in the right column all these suggestions, right, for the next video to watch. Which one do you pick? You pick the one that you're curious about. And you can end up going down a rabbit hole that isn't even related directly to the video that you were watching. And you end up watching another video, and all of a sudden you've spent all this time actually learning, engaging the world, you know, or laughing, being entertained. There are all these elements to it that are all woven together, which is part of what's great with it. But the thing is that it's curiosity driven. The next thing isn't driven by a curriculum design. It's driven by curiosity. And this is the reason that my son, for example, who's now 23, really had a hard time in school. In part because, I mean, he's ridiculously smart, and he got frustrated with the order of things. He got frustrated with the way the curriculum was designed, where somebody else is saying what the next thing is. He wanted to go where he wanted to go next. And I'm a teacher. I was a college professor. I understand the value of curriculum design. I will not, you know, slam that. But there is this other way of learning that's driven by curiosity and allows you to sort of trace your way down these wormholes of curiosity-driven learning that I think is wiring our kids' brains up differently. It's actually causing them to think in a different way and to think more divergently as a result. Happiness is another element of curiosity. There's a Gallup survey of 130 countries that identified 2 factors that had the strongest influence on how much enjoyment a person experienced in the day. Isn't that an interesting study?
Yeah.
And the 2 elements were being able to count on someone for help and learning something new. Those were the 2 elements that led to the most enjoyment in the day in this study. So there's another curiosity-based element. So there are all these things. It's not just a nice way to be. It's not just a really pleasant posture to have in the world. It also leads to these really tangible outcomes in terms of intelligence and health and happiness.
No, lower stress, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, well, I really wanted to address the internet with you. You have something you wanted to say.
I completely agree with the whole rabbit hole of especially YouTube. I have 2 very distinct memories of 2 very deep rabbit holes that I went down. One about the corruption of the hair extension industry using real human hair, and another about the life of ballerinas, both that I have never been curious about before, never really thought about before. But once I gained this knowledge, I just kept going and going, and now I've learned so much more. And the curiosity's really allowed me to expand what I thought I was interested in and what I thought I knew.
Oh, that's fantastic. That's such a great example, because it was, like you said, it's nothing that you thought you would be going after, right? It just pops into your view and you say, oh, that's interesting, and you follow it. My daughter for a while was really, really into John Oliver's show, you know, when it first came out. And, you know, he does this deep dive into one topic. And she came downstairs one day, I just remember this so clearly, and she said, oh man, do you know what I'm pissed about? And I said, what? And she said, infrastructure. Which is, it's true. It's absolutely infuriating, but it's nothing that she ever would have thought that she'd cross paths with. But this guy who knows how to do it, you know, who really does it well, and it's very informative as well as funny, had led her to this thing, just like what you're describing with the hair extensions. That's perfect. You end up finding things through this curiosity-driven path that you would not have found otherwise, that you would not have found on a very formal, logical progression. It's new, and I really think that it's going to change the way this generation thinks and acts in ways that are quite positive and quite exciting.
Okay, so I think we can't have a discussion about that with also talking about controls on internet behavior and exploration. I have struggled with this. You've not wanted me to put any digital parental controls on because you say that it really limits what you can do overly.
I feel very suffocated when I have parental controls. I know that I am smart enough to not, sign up for the wrong things, you know, put mommy's credit card information into a scammy website, or stay up way too late at night. I don't need a monitor on me to control what I know and what I learn and what I do.
Well, okay. But I feel like there has to be some controls. I want to generally know what's going on and making sure, because I see that with a lot of kids and with you and sometimes, that there's an addictive aspect to it. And it's just, you know, and I fall into that as well. You know, you can get onto YouTube and sort of, you know, not be able to stop in some ways. And so, Dale, just wonder if you have any thoughts on how parents can monitor things without being suffocating, and so that there's healthy exploration going on with the internet.
Yeah, I think it's a really, it's a great point. What we tried to do, what I tried to do was to, you know, you watch for signs of a problem. You know, you watch for spending too much time locked in the room or something, or grades going down, or any sort of an external thing like that, my preference has been to allow those to be the warning signs rather than, this has just been my approach. What I want my kids to do is to be able to make mistakes. I really want them to have the experience of getting into that. It's a terrible feeling for me when I realized that I just spent an hour and a half doing nothing. I completely wasted an hour and a half, and my brain feels drained, and I got nothing out of it. I actually want them to do that, experience it, feel how gross it is, and learn from it in that way. I think making mistakes in a relatively safe environment, Maxine brought up the credit card and that sort of thing. You do want to watch out for that. But in terms of encountering troubling content, violent, gory, overtly sexual content, whatever, I actually want my kids to make those mistakes so that they can register them and learn from them. Because if I intercept in advance and warn them, it won't have any staying power. Whereas if they experience is always, it's such a cliche, experience is the best teacher. But it's true. It's the reason that, even in less dramatic ways, when I think I talked about this on another show, when my daughter wanted to buy a cross necklace, or she bought one at the dollar store, and asked me if it was okay for her to wear it to school. I could have come up with reasons to ask her to not wear it. Well, it's not really, honest because, she considered herself an agnostic at that point or whatever. But I wasn't looking for reasons to not allow something. I'm looking for reasons to allow experience. And so I said, hey, you're never going to know because what she said, actually, this was interesting. She said, the reason she wondered whether she wanted to do it is that she felt dishonest. She felt like people might think she believed when she really doesn't. And the fact is she just kind of likes it because it's a pretty necklace. And she used to spin the beads when she would, take a test or something because it made her feel better. And I said, wear it for a week and see what you think, because you're never going to know. You're never going to know what it feels like unless you try that and then make a decision. And obviously that doesn't apply to driving 150 miles an hour. There are certain, you have to balance the risk and reward. But if I had just said, no, I really don't want you to do that, it wouldn't have had the staying power. But as it is, she got to the end of the week. She said, you know what? I'm not going to wear it anymore because it makes me feel weird. And then she knew. And I try to do the same thing with online stuff. I try to let them get into hairy situations that they can then back out of, again, within reason in terms of financial liability and so on. But that's just generally been my approach. And I'm really, really happy with the ethical comprehension that my kids have as a result, and with their self-discipline. That's what we ultimately want, is to have kids who are self-disciplined, not just disciplined. So
that reminds me of a story I've mentioned here before, and I don't know if you remember this, but we were a bunch of parents were at somebody's home. A bunch of kids were all playing in the backyard, and there was one little kid that was climbing up on a stool, and then there was a tire thing, and she was getting up on that, and her mother said, "Do you feel safe?" And the kid said, "Yeah, I feel safe," and continued on until she knew she had like climbed as high that was comfortable to her. But just that check-in with the mother I thought was really interesting. And it kind of reminds me of what you're talking about. And the other thing I want to say is how important communication is between parents and kids about what they are doing on the internet. Yes, you can, certainly get those types of access where you get an email that just literally shows you what websites your kids have been visiting. Haven't figured out a way to do that with every device, but I was able to do it with your PC. So that's informative for sure, but it's not enough if you're not having some kind of good communication about just, discussing not necessarily, well, show me the sites you visited, but just what kinds of things have you been curious about? What kinds of things have you been learning about? What kinds of websites have you been visiting? What kind of games are you playing, and that kind of thing? I think that is very helpful, having that discussion, to talk about what's, say, gone on in the last week, as opposed to, okay, here's what you're going to visit, here's what you're not going to visit, and trying to put on all those controls ahead of time. So having them learn those kind of lessons for themselves to see what it actually feels like, and then make their own decisions, like you're saying, Dale, I think is so healthy for everybody. Your thoughts, and then we'll probably wrap up.
I don't like it, but I am okay.
Don't like what?
I'm gonna. I am okay if you say, you cannot do this. I mean, I don't like it, but I'm fine with it as long as you provide me with a reason. Like, I think from a very young age, I've always hated the phrase, like, you can't do this because I said so.
Okay, I've never said that.
Can no, not you. I'm saying
everyone, like, that was never said in our household.
As
just to be clear.
Yeah. But I have been told that by, like, other parents when I'm over at a friend's house, or I've heard it in passing. I always thought I was entitled to an answer, and entitled to a reason, even if I can't make that mistake myself. I want to understand the risks and why my parent feels, or some other parent feels, that this is not the best route for me to take. Makes
sense. How is it going to actually harm you or someone else? Right.
Yeah, and the great thing about that is that you then kids learn that there are reasons for rules, that there are reasons behind it. So that then as you grow up and as you leave the nest, you're going to be making your own rules. And you're going to learn to have reason-based rules. There are things that actually have a logic behind them because you've seen it modeled by your own parents. That's why, because I said so, is creating a particular attitude toward authority. It's creating an authoritarian situation where because I am the authority, this goes. Authoritative parenting is giving you those reasons and modeling your ability to then create your own reasons as you grow up. And it's a much stronger, you're much less likely to be one of those kids who goes off to college and goes off the high dive and gets drunk every night and all that sort of thing, because they have all their structure was based on their parents being in the room. Right? It's based on the authority of the parent. And as soon as they're out of that view, they don't know how to make their own rules because they don't see the connection to reason. So the fact that your mom did that is phenomenal, and that you recognize that, and that you're more likely to do it with your own kids if you have kids.
I think that, and I hope I can put this in a way that makes sense. The idea that if you prevent a child from having certain experiences that you consider to be potentially harmful will then prevent them from ever choosing to have those experiences later is a fallacy. What you're wanting to instill is their learning, and to open the door to their learning, which may involve them actually having negative experiences, and then you build on that. So I think the goals are the same for most parents, that they want their children to ultimately, when they grow up, make great choices for themselves, to be happy, to be in a place that's fulfilling to them. But you do have to let go a little bit. You do have to be willing to trust them in order for that to take place. With that, I want to thank our guests, Dale McGowan, of course, and our guest of the day, Maxine. Thank you so much for being with us and sharing your wisdom. I learned a lot, actually, from hearing some of the things you had to say.
I'm glad.
Yeah, totally neat. So this has been Parenting Beyond Belief. I want to shout out thanks to Mark and Vern, who have been working behind the scenes. So appreciate all you do to just make this whole show happen. Thanks to you for watching. Definitely give us your comments and subscribe. And now we think it's time to go and hug your kid. Take care.